In 1951, David Wingate joined an expedition to the islet of Castle Harbor to investigate reports of a bird officially considered extinct. Instead of evidence of extinction, the team found 7 pairs of Bermuda petrels, 14 birds on the entire planet. The discovery became a sensation, but the euphoria faded quickly. Most of the former nesting sites had already been destroyed. Over the following decade, the population grew only from 18 to approximately 24 nesting pairs. Then David Wingate launched a recovery program. He cleared the islands of invasive species and built artificial burrows for birds that no longer had anywhere to nest. But the hardest part of the rescue was only just beginning. The cahao had been considered completely extinct since the 1620s. Colonists had introduced rats, cats, and pigs to Bermuda, and the bird nested directly in burrows in the ground with no protection whatsoever. Nearly 3 centuries passed with no confirmed sighting. In 1906, a dead bird of an unfamiliar species washed ashore, then another in 1935, and another in 1941. Each carcass raised the same question: were these remains of a long-vanished species, or did a small population still live somewhere at sea that nobody knew about? The last carcass was found in 1945 on Cooper's Island. This time, it was decided not merely to identify the bird, but to search for living ones. In January 1951, American ornithologist Robert Cushman Murphy and Bermuda Aquarium curator Louis Mowbray organized a search expedition to a group of tiny rocky islets in Castle Harbor. The team invited a 15-year-old David Wingate, a local schoolboy known for his knowledge of Bermuda's birds. The search lasted more than 2 weeks. On January 28th, they found a deep crevice in the rock on one of the islets. Murphy personally pulled a bird out and exclaimed, "My God, the cahao!" 7. Nesting pairs across 4 islets, a species not seen alive in 330 years. The news traveled across world media within days. It seemed the hardest part was already over. The species had been found, it was alive. All that remained was to give it peace and time. In reality, the hardest part was only beginning. 7 pairs is not a margin of safety. It is the threshold on which a species balances between survival and extinction, and the cahao's own biology made that threshold even thinner. The female lays 1 egg, 1 for the entire breeding season. If the egg is lost, there is no second chance until the following year. Even under favorable conditions, half the eggs fail to hatch. The chicks grow slowly, and then the parents do something biologists still shrug at. A week before the first flight, they leave. They simply abandon the chick. They fly out to sea and don't return. The chick either learns to fly on its own or dies. Between 28 and 35% of young birds do not survive their first year, and those that do survive are in no hurry to breed. They return to the island to nest only 3 to 6 years after birth. This meant one thing: the 7 pairs of 1951 could not simply recover on their own. Every lost season meant years lost going forward. And then another player appeared. The white-tailed tropic bird, beautiful and snow white, a symbol of Bermuda, wanted the same burrows the cahao did. It is slightly larger, and when cahao parents were out at sea searching for food, the tropic bird would enter the burrow and kill the chick. Not out of malice, simply competition for real estate. In the first year after the discovery, every single cahao chick died at the hands of tropic birds. Everyone. The population froze at 7 pairs and did not move for 10 years. 10 years during which the teenager who had held that first bird in 1951 kept studying and knew he would come back, so that those 10 years would not become 10 more. David Wingate enrolled at Cornell University to study zoology. In 1957, he returned to Bermuda with a specific goal: to make sure 7 pairs would not remain the last. At first, he worked on grants from the New York Zoological Society. He would not receive an official position as Bermuda's government conservation officer until 1966, the first such post on the islands. Until then, it was one man, a few tiny islets, and a species with the worst possible reproductive biology. The first problem was the tropic birds. Wingate solved it mechanically, with wooden baffles at the entrance to each burrow, sized so the K-How could pass through and the tropic bird could not. He installed them by hand, burrow by burrow, island by island, for years. The first chick pair to survive after the baffles were installed confirmed the idea worked. But while the baffles were protecting chicks from tropic birds, a new threat appeared, one no baffle could solve. In the mid-1960s, Wingate began noticing that eggs were failing to hatch more often than before. He collected unfertilized eggs and dead chicks and sent them to chemist Charles Worcester at Stony Brook University. The analysis found DDT, a pesticide accumulating in the marine food chain, at a concentration of 6.44 parts per million. The eggshells were thinning and cracking under the weight of the parents. In 1968, Wingate and Worcester published their data in the journal Science. They warned that if the trend continued, reproduction in the species would stop entirely by 1978. DDT was banned in the United States in 1972. The population got another chance, not thanks to a baffle or concrete, but because Wingate documented and proved a problem nobody else would have noticed. As one threat receded, another appeared that nobody had anticipated. In the late 1960s, NASA built a satellite tracking station on Cooper's Island, a few kilometers from the nesting islets. Its powerful lighting, until 1976, flooded every nighttime islet of Castle Harbor with light. The K-How is a nocturnal bird. Chicks flying out to sea for the first time at night become disoriented by bright light, circle, and crash to the ground. One nesting area was likely abandoned for exactly this reason. Wingate secured a partial dimming of the station, the first victory in a battle against artificial light that would continue for decades. And there still remained a problem no correspondence could solve. Space. 4 tiny rocky islets, the smallest, 1/4 of an acre, the largest, 3.5 acres. Together, less than 5 acres of land. Even if every pair bred at maximum efficiency, the islands physically could not hold a larger population. There weren't enough natural burrows. So Wingate began building concrete burrows, artificial shelters of reinforced concrete, precisely sized for the bird, dug into the soft limestone, with an entrance angle that made access difficult for predators. Each one used between 400 and 800 pounds of concrete, mixed by hand in buckets and ferried by boat to the rocky islet. He built them, and the birds moved in. Not immediately. The K-How is conservative in its choice of nest site, but gradually the artificial burrows became permanent homes, and pairs returned to the same spots year after year. There is one entry in Wingate's diary that explains more about him than any of the numbers above. On the day of his wedding, across several pages he describes in detail every bird he saw that day, the observation route, the weather, behavior, timing. The wedding gets 7 words. This is not an anecdote about an absent-minded zoologist. It is an exact portrait of a man for whom the boundary between work and vocation had dissolved so long ago that he no longer saw a difference. It was precisely this willingness to see the project as a whole, rather than separate tasks, that allowed Wingate to go further than wooden baffles and concrete burrows. He understood that saving one species while ignoring the island around it meant saving a bird for emptiness. Wingate understood. A bird could be saved and released into an empty landscape, or the landscape could be restored. He chose the latter. He launched the most ambitious island restoration project ever undertaken by a single person. The goal: return Nonsuch Island to the condition it had been in before 1609, before the first English ship and the first introduced plants. Wingate removed invasive plants by hand, species by species, plot by plot. He brought back native coastal vegetation. He sourced seeds of plants that had grown in Bermuda before colonization, finding them on isolated rocks people had never reached. Along with the K-How, yellow-crowned night herons, Bermuda skinks, terrestrial hermit crabs, and other vanished species returned to the island as soon as the habitat became suitable again. There is a detail most accounts of the K-How omit. Wingate understood that the bird and the island were one system. The K-How's burrows aerated the soil. Its droppings fertilized the vegetation above the burrows. The vegetation held the soil against erosion. Erosion did not wash out the burrows. The burrows remained suitable for nesting. Remove the bird and the entire cycle breaks. So restoring the vegetation and restoring the population were not 2 parallel projects, they were one. In parallel, the K-How multiplied in the concrete burrows and gradually settled into the restored forest. Then in 2003, Hurricane Fabian struck Bermuda with a force the archipelago had not seen in its entire history of observation. Waves submerged the Castle Harbor islets entirely, and water stood over them for hours, washing away everything in its path. When the storm withdrew, it turned out that more than 80% of the concrete burrows had been damaged or destroyed. The same burrows Wingate had mixed and ferried by boat over 43 years. A single night took what had taken decades to build. Nesting sites flooded, eggs lost, parts of the islets unusable for the season. And yet the population did not fall to a critical level because the burrows that survived were enough for the next breeding season. A system he had built with no guarantee it would ever face the worst case turned out capable of surviving that worst case. The following spring, the birds returned to the same islets, to the same surviving burrows. In 1951, there were 7 pairs, 14 birds. In 1962, after the first complete census, there were 18 pairs and 8 chicks that year. By 2000, when Wingate retired, there were 53 to 55 pairs. Over 43 years, one man brought the population from 7 to 55 pairs. This is not the kind of arithmetic where nature simply did its work and a person just stayed out of the way. For comparison, consider the California condor, another species that nearly disappeared in the 20th century. In 1987, only 27 remained. To save the species, every bird was taken into captivity, bred in zoos, and gradually released back. The program cost tens of millions of dollars and lasted decades. This does not mean one approach is better than the other. It means that for the Keahau, this particular approach worked. But by 2000, when Wingate retired, the project had run into a wall that wooden baffles and concrete could no longer overcome. 55 pairs is more than 7, but it is still a population living on 4 scraps of rock totaling less than 5 acres, rising only a meter above the ocean, and having already lost 80% of its shelters to a single hurricane. Further growth required more space, and there was no more space on these islets. Nonsuch, a neighboring island 7 times larger than all 4 islets combined, higher above sea level and sheltered from waves, had stood nearby all these years. Wingate himself had restored its ecosystem back in the 1960s, but Keahaus did not nest there. Birds, like people, returned to where they were born, and no Keahau had been born on Nonsuch since the 1620s. To change that required doing something Wingate had opposed his entire life: intervening in where exactly the bird is born. The project passed to Jeremy Medeiros. To begin the expansion at all, Medeiros had to travel to Australia to learn from biologist Nicholas Carlisle, who had relocated Gould's petrels in New South Wales. No such technique existed in any Bermudian handbook. He came back with a specific protocol: when to take a chick, how to feed it, how much it should weigh, when to release it at night so it would imprint on its new address. The mechanics were these. Medeiros took chicks 3 weeks before their first flight, when they were developed enough but had not yet flown. He ferried them by boat to Nonsuch, placed them in new concrete burrows, and hand-fed them fresh squid and anchovies daily until each bird flew out to sea on its own. The idea was simple. The bird would remember the place where it first opened its eyes before its first flight and would return there years later. The first relocation in 2004, 14 chicks. Success rate 100%. Between 2004 and 2008, 105 chicks were transferred, 102 of which successfully flew out to sea. They were expected to return in 3 to 6 years. In 2005, in the middle of this first phase, rats were discovered on Nonsuch. Black rats had swum over from the main island and established their own population on the island where dozens of chicks of a rare species had just been relocated, infected by the very predator that had destroyed the Keahau 400 years earlier. Medeiros eliminated the rats and set up a perimeter monitoring system for the island. The relocation continued. In February 2008, Medeiros went out to Nonsuch at night to check the solar-powered sound system used to attract the birds. A Keahau flew over him and began circling, then a second. Within half an hour, 5 or 6 birds were flying over the island. The first landed 3 meters from him. These were birds from the first relocation phase. They had come back. In 2009, the first pair nested on Nonsuch, for the first time since the 1620s. The islets where Kahaw's had nested since 1951 continue rising no more than 1 meter above sea level, and that is precisely why relocation to Nonsuch was not a whim but a necessity. Today, infrared cameras stand there. Kahaw Cam is a live stream from an underground burrow that people around the world have watched for more than 50 million minutes in recent years. The program's official goal is 1,000 nesting pairs. Only then can the species be moved from critically endangered to endangered status. Madero says openly, "I will certainly not live to see it." Right now, there are 165 nesting pairs. More than 330 adult birds are on the same few acres of rock where only 14 remained in 1951. The Kahaw has been saved, but it remains dependent. 85% of birds nest in artificial burrows. Remove the maintenance system, and the natural shelters on the islets would not be enough. Invasive species attempt to return every year. The tropic bird population has not disappeared. This is a species living in an environment where every element is sustained by human hands, just as human hands once destroyed that same environment. There is a question the program does not resolve, only raises. Where is the line between rescue and management? If a species can exist only in an environment actively maintained by people, is that wild nature or a very large open-air zoo? At the current rate, roughly 5 to 7 new pairs per year, reaching 1,000 pairs is still decades away. Nonsuch is technically capable of holding up to 5,000. But until the larger part of the population moves there, the Castle Harbor islets, jutting a single meter above the ocean, remain the only real home for most of the birds. The old infrastructure is becoming unreliable. The new one has not yet absorbed enough birds. Between them lies a window of vulnerability that could last another 20 years. There is no answer. There are 165 pairs that do not ask the question. On an island the size of a small park in the middle of the Atlantic, the Kahaw returns every spring. 3 years after being born. 4, 6. It does not know who built any of this. It simply comes back. Just as Wingate returned every year with cement, baffles, notebooks to an island that according to official records held nothing worth attention since the 1620s. He first arrived there as a teenager invited as a consultant. He stayed for the rest of his life.